time. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm introducing today the Air Services Amendment Bill 2016 because communities around the country that are affected by aircraft noise are not being represented and not being protected. The rules that govern flight paths and community consultation are written for businesses and operators, not for the communities that live with aircraft noise every day. Now, this bill comes on the back of several years of my constituents working with the current law to seek a solution to issues of aircraft noise in Melbourne. In this time, I've spoken in this place about the experience of my constituents and tabled a petition in Parliament signed by hundreds of residents. I and my office have joined residents in meetings with representatives of various federal agencies, airports and aircraft operators. My colleague, the Green Senator for Victoria Janet Rice, has further raised the issue in Senate estimates and other forums. And I know that Senator Rice and others have been doing similar work with communities affected by aircraft noise around the country. What's clear after this protracted process that's taken place over many years is that the law needs to change. Legislation is required to change and clarify the responsibilities of federal agencies so that when it comes to aircraft noise, communities have a voice. And in introducing this bill, I'd like to inform the House about the problems faced by some of my constituents in Melbourne. And some aspects of the air noise issue my constituents face are specific to Melbourne and reflective of the growing pressures on the livability of our city. But beyond the specific circumstances, the experience of my constituents are deeply illustrative of the problems faced by communities around the country, and we'll find parallels in the experiences of the constituents of many of my fellow parliamentarians. So, Deputy Speaker, I was first in contact with the residents of the suburb of East Melbourne in my electorate regarding aircraft noise in 2013. At that time, residents told me that they'd noticed a significant increase in small aircraft, such as helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft, flying at low altitude over the suburb. Now, the observation of residents were borne out by the official flight path data, which show that small aircraft commonly circle in the airspace above these suburbs. In one weekend, over 200 flights took place over the suburb, and I understand that the number of small aircraft flights over residential areas has been increasing over time. Many may be looking at the MCG or the city, not essential flights by any means, but certainly not flights taken in a way designed to disrupt, to avoid disruption of residents. For those who don't know, the area of Melbourne and East Melbourne, it adjoins the CBD, it adjoins the MCG, and increasingly over many, many years, operators have decided to fly low aircraft, fly fixed-wing and helicopters at low levels over these suburbs. Now, subsequently, it also appears that the flight paths of larger aircraft may also have been altered, resulting in an increase in air noise from these flights over the suburb. And I've been contacted by residents in other neighbourhoods, including Fitzroy, Richmond and Kensington, have also noticed an increase in air traffic. And meanwhile, residents in Docklands experience high-frequency, extremely loud flights near to residential buildings, often from helicopter traffic. It became very clear, as we tried to get to the bottom of this and how to deal with it, that the buck stopped with nobody. In seeking a review of the situation from federal agencies, my constituents were sent from door to door and told repeatedly that no response was possible. Air Services Australia is the government organisation established to provide services to the aviation industry, and residents are encouraged to contact it to raise concerns. But nowhere in the legislation governing Air Services Australia is there a requirement that it considers or minimises the impact of aircraft noise on the human and natural environment, community amenity and residential areas. Repeatedly, residents in my electorate were told that the airspace above their homes was uncontrolled. That is to say, neither air traffic control nor federal regulations applied to this airspace. Air Services Australia and CASA do have responsibility for planning and controlling flight paths, but are only empowered to do so with a view towards safety, efficiency for the industry or broader environmental issues. The legislation is silent when it comes to the responsibility to minimise the impact of flights on the human and natural environment, community amenity and residential areas. Because federal agencies are not required to protect community amenity or residential areas, airspace over residential areas is, if considered safe to fly in, not monitored or controlled. This means that small aircraft can fly almost at will, at relatively low levels over suburbs, causing great distress and annoyance to residents. In uncontrolled airspace like this, the only option available to communities is to seek voluntary agreements from aircraft operators. But this relies on goodwill. And my constituents have written to hundreds of aircraft operators but have received very few responses. Supported by the advocacy of residents, the City of Melbourne, the Council, has worked to create a so-called fly-neighbourly agreement to raise concerns of residents with aircraft operators and to seek an agreement to establish voluntary guidelines. And this process is ongoing, and I acknowledge the important work of residents groups, the City of Melbourne, of our Greens councillors Rohan Leppard and Cathy Oak in pushing this process forward. Nonetheless, when the law makes no federal agency responsible for protecting the community, the power is very much with the operators and the businesses rather than the residents when seeking voluntary agreements. When I and my constituents repeatedly requested simple noise monitoring of aircraft over East Melbourne just to establish a clear picture of the scale of the problem, we were told that this would be impossible because the airspace is not controlled. How is it that we can have high-intensity air traffic occurring over homes and impacting residents, but the federal agencies that exist to monitor and control air noise are not even able to record noise levels, let alone to take any action to address it? Meanwhile, consultation mechanisms have been flawed. Too often, residents are simply unaware of changes to flight paths above their homes until they find out because of the significant increase in noise they hear daily once the changes have already happened. How can there be genuine consultation on aircraft noise when residents aren't even informed until it's too late? It's a key principle that in our cities and our regions, residents should have a meaningful say in the decisions that have an impact on their community. But when it comes to flight paths, this currently isn't the case. And I fear that if this continues, we are putting at risk the livability of our cities that we value so highly. And this bill is addressing a problem that is emblematic to all of us who want more people to live in the inner city. We have to manage the pressures that come along with that. It's time for a change to truly give communities a voice and independent support. And for this reason, I'm pleased to introduce this bill. We will do a number of things. First, we'll enshrine in law new requirements for consultation with communities and give residents stronger independent representation when consulted. Under the bill, Air Services Australia must inform residents affected by changes to flight paths and, crucially, to involve them in the process of environmental assessments with the amenity of residents considered. When a flight path change is proposed, Air Services Australia will be required to inform the minister responsible, who in turn is to appoint a community aviation advocate to represent the affected parts of the community. The community aviation advocate is to be completely independent of Air Services Australia. Second, it will establish in legislation an aircraft noise ombudsman independent of Air Services Australia. And this will offer important oversight and make recommendations to relevant agencies and ministers. And third, it will amend the role of Air Services Australia in legislation to include a requirement to minimise the impact of aircraft operations on the human and natural environment, community amenity and residential areas. This broadens the responsibility of Air Services Australia in monitoring and controlling airspace, and I believe will place a requirement on Air Services Australia to consider airspace over residential areas that it currently does not. Fourth, the bill will require that the Air Services Australia Board include an expert in environmental management and a representative of a community group affected by aircraft noise. And fifth, in response to the specific and acute circumstances of high-intensity flights of small aircraft in uncontrolled airspace over Melbourne, will prohibit flights of helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft below 2,000 metres above sea level within 5 kilometres of central Melbourne, with clear exemptions in the public interest of emergency services, defence and other like aircraft. And this bill includes several aspects of a previous private member's bill introduced in 2011 by the then member for Pearce, the Honourable Judy Moylan MP. I'd like to acknowledge the former member for her work on the issue. The 2011 bill was supported, with amendments, by the coalition parties at the time, and I voted in favour of it. Ultimately, however, the bill was narrowly defeated in the House by 1 vote. Since that time, the ongoing gaps in community representation in controlling the impacts of air traffic have remained. Now, Mr Speaker, this bill would give Melbourne similar rules to that of Paris when it comes to small aircraft flying over the city and over residential areas, and of course, it won't affect any flights taken in connection with hospitals, emergency services, defence or other aircraft. It's time for action on behalf of communities affected by aircraft noise, and as such, I commend the bill to the House.